So what's keeping you awake tonight? In the 30 plus years I've been watching movies, there are two films whose opening shots still fill me with the same sense of awe I had when I first saw them. The first one I'm sure you're familiar with. The second one, though, is this. This is the famed Hades landscape of Los Angeles, only a few years from now by Philip K. Dick's reckonings, in Ridley Scott's landmark film, Blade Runner. Now, I didn't see Blade Runner until the director's cut came out in my teens, but by that point its position as both one of the great science fiction films and also one of the great visual achievements in movie history had already been cemented. And as still amazing as I find this movie to be despite dozens of repeat viewings, the other amazing thing is when it was first written, none of what you see here was ever supposed to be created. That all came primarily from the mind of Ridley Scott, using his own influences from reading heavy metal comics and particularly the stories of Jean Giraud, the French artist also known as Mobius. One of the primary reasons why Blade Runner still holds up and is also a film which almost requires multiple viewings is something that's one of the most essential but also most difficult parts of telling a story. Building a world that is both believable and true to the story you're trying to tell. And love him or hate him, few directors have had a better eye for creating more fantastic yet still believable worlds than Ridley Scott. While Scott's directorial debut came in 1977 with a period piece called The Duelists, it wasn't until 1979's Alien that audiences got their first real glimpse of what he could do with a science fiction story. What makes it work is the same thing that makes Blade Runner work. Even though it's set in the middle of outer space and a strange planet, there isn't a moment where the visual structure of Alien fails to support the story it's trying to tell. That being 7 space truckers on their way home who suddenly find themselves at the mercy of a creature they can't stop. In Blade Runner, Scott had the unenviable task of taking Dick's short story Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep and making it into something that audiences could believe was a glimpse of what the future could be. But during the formation of the original screenplay, writer Hampton Fancher envisioned a futuristic story told in very small spaces. Fancher's plot moved between apartments and rooms as Deckard pursued Roy Batty and his band of replicants. And even though it was still set in the future, there would have been very little future to see except for maybe the occasional glimpse out a window. Now, it could be argued that such a version of Blade Runner might work, but in hindsight, it'd be very strange to consider what we'd be missing out on by limiting the perspective to such close quarters. This was something Ridley Scott was also curious about as he read those early screenplays, and after meeting with Fancher and the producers, he seemed more interested in what lay beyond those confined areas.
The hunter falls in love with the hunted, except they never move outside the apartment. It's very interior. I want to take them outside the door. Once we go outside the door, this world has to support the thesis that she's android, humanoid, robot.
In my experience as a writer and storyteller, this is one of the things I've seen both taken for granted and not taken advantage of more by other writers and storytellers. Take George Lucas, for instance. When the original Star Wars was released in 1977, Lucas had to follow the traditional route of having set pieces and location shots help create the story he was trying to tell. And while the original trilogy does have its faults, what it wasn't lacking was enough realism in its environments to allow for the plausible suspension of disbelief. It's that suspension of disbelief which allows the viewer or reader to accept that even though the story is created on Earth in the latter 20th century, we can override that knowledge and allow ourselves to be taken on the ride to somewhere long ago in a galaxy far, far away. Now, fast forward 35 years and you find while Lucas's imagination has remained fairly constant, the worlds he's constructed feel considerably less real than they did in his original trilogy. Watching Episode 2, Attack of the Clones, for instance, there's hardly ever a point where it's not obvious that the actors are moving through sets and interacting with characters who are not there. As a result, the prequels feel one- or two-dimensional at best because even to the casual viewer, the lack of a tangible, credible world to support the weight of the narrative story ultimately makes it fall flat. Which brings us back to why a film like Blade Runner managed to have such a sustained longevity and assume its rightful place as a classic, despite initial criticism that it was a storytelling failure. For Scott, making a film set in a future nearly 40 years away at the time meant not only taking the ideas and concepts of Philip K. Dick's original story, but also trying to envision what such a world would actually look like. To that end, he went to work converting old backlots and sound stages into something an audience could look at and come away with the reasonable conclusion that this could be Los Angeles in the year 2019. Using the vision of futuristic artists like Sid Mead, just like he had with Ron Cobb in Alien, Scott managed to put together a crew who could create a vision of what a futuristic city could look like, using everything that we know goes into a modern city today. As a result, Blade Runner did something few movies have done before or since in impacting the landscape of how cities evolved. One only needs to look at New York's Times Square or the streets of Hong Kong or Shanghai or Tokyo or even Los Angeles today, and you can see its influence everywhere.
When the film opened in London, there was a film critic, a lady, she used to be quite a prominent film critic at the time. She said, when I saw this film, I thought, what are they trying to say? It's all filth, rain, millions of people everywhere and all the rest of it. She said, then I walked out into Leicester Square into Blade Runner. And it made sense. I mean, that's what it was about.
When I was in college and doodling around with ideas for science fiction and fantasy stories, there was often no end of feedback from my more pretentious and condescending peers and even my professors about how world building isn't as essential as creating vivid characters, snappy dialogue, or engaging plot points. And while there is a grain of truth in the need for those elements to exist in any good story, even ones that have nothing to do with the fantastical, the fact remains that unless they have a believable backdrop to play against, you risk not being able to engage the audience and your story is ultimately going to fall flat, no matter how well defined the characters are or how snappy their dialogue is. Conversely, the same is also true for spending too much time on world building and not enough time fleshing out characters or how they interact with one another. Sometimes you can make the world be realistic enough, but the characters who inhabit them just aren't. It's definitely a fine line which lacks clear points of demarcation, but the end goal remains constant, creating as three-dimensional a world as possible for the audience to step into. Even with his early success with Alien and Blade Runner, even Scott isn't immune to what happens when you don't have a story which can support the visual world it's built on. A prime example of this is Prometheus. Watching this film, in spite of Scott's now legendary eye for visual storytelling, the story itself didn't fit against the epic backdrop, and the overall experience suffered greatly as a result. Now, as we approach 2019, we know that both Philip K. Dick and Ridley Scott were wrong. We have no replicants, there are no flying cars, Los Angeles is not covered in smoke and rain all hours of the day or marked with colossal arcologies, and human beings aren't living in the far reaches of known space. Despite that, Blade Runner still holds up because while we haven't achieved those technological goals, that didn't stop Ridley Scott from telling a story which is very much relevant in our modern, real-world dystopic present. And make no mistake, we all live, work, and exist very much in a dystopia of our own making. We do have overcrowded cities, massive urban sprawl, and environmental threats which endanger all of us. Turn on the news or go on the internet, and there's seemingly no end of accounts of people's lives being cut short because they are different, and our supposedly modern societies cannot tolerate such fundamental differences. We're constantly looking for ways to extend our lives while also having to come to grips with the harsh fact that relationships are becoming more and more fleeting and we may only get a few years at best to be with those who matter most to us. And we're faced with the very real understanding that despite all we can achieve in the short time we have, in the end all we are our memories and experiences, which inevitably get lost and fade, as Roy Batty so eloquently says, like tears in rain. For all its future noir trappings, Blade Runner reminds us of what it is to be human. What Ridley Scott created was a film warning us of what we can become and forsaking that humanity. That despite all of our technological achievements and the excesses which can come with them, what makes us who we are is what we do with our own agency. It's not an unfamiliar story, and it's one we'll be told again and again as the years go by, but few versions of it have been so stylishly crafted as Blade Runner. It's one of those rare films that, if you love it, you can always return to it and find things you maybe didn't see before, or else you can just sit back and enjoy it for what it is. One of the best science fiction films ever made. Now go get some sleep, and sweet dreams when you get there.